Charlie, can you see the number of participants?
I don't think I can.
Janelle, can you? Or is it Anne Marie? Anne Marie's meeting?
There's only 5 of us at the moment. 6.
As we get going, I'd love to know those numbers.
But right now, we don't have any members of the public logged in. It's just us.
Motion to adjourn.
Well, the governor is speaking right now. Did you all? You might have just mentioned that. I just logged in.
I saw
Yeah.
his directive there. Yeah.
So he's giving a big press conference right now.
But we're going to have a meeting one way or another because Charlie didn't dress up for nothing.
Should I stand up and show you my jeans?
You know, that's the beauty of Zoom is, you know, whatever you wear on the lower half of your body. I wear sweatpants. I'm just going to say it. I wear sweatpants and I wear a work-related top.
It would be shorts, except for it's freezing.
It is freezing. We now have 2 members of the public, Nancy Stacy and Sumner Crosby.
Good.
If anybody heard that, it was just a sparkling water. I don't know if you heard me crack open my can. It was louder than I expected.
Hey guys, this is Josh Kelly with DEMA. It has all of us logged in as Karen. So if you see 3 Karen Montez, that's 3 of us from DEMA.
Gotcha.
Wonderful.
Josh, we should be able to rename ourselves. I just did that to myself.
All right, thank you, Phil.
Yes, sir.
Disregard them.
The 3 dots at the top right should. If you click on that.
We now have 3 participants. Kay Carnahan has joined us, or attendees, I should say.
Still
Should we
not
give
2
it-
yet.
Should we give it a couple more minutes?
I thought maybe the mitigation team would be there. Yeah.
Danielle's
Danielle?
here.
Yeah.
You're here, Charlie.
Yeah. Give it a couple, I think.
Yeah, I guess Rob Morgan. I would have thought maybe.
Small level of frustration is the same as a big frustration, so that goes to practice. So you don't technically have to do it. You don't have to respond to it. You still got to show that it's still got a lot of what is that?
So we now have 6 attendees on, Charlie, and it's 2:01, so I don't know how much time you want to give for people to join.
Whenever you guys are ready, I'm ready.
We can get started.
Okay. So welcome everyone to the public meeting for the West Cedar Street flood mitigation study. GMB is going to make a presentation and talk about what the study's all concerning and what we've accomplished thus far and what we plan on doing in the upcoming months to finish the study and our report associated with it. So I thought maybe I'd give you some history of why the study is being done and some of the physical experiences that the city observes pretty regularly. Years ago, there was a berm out at the end of West Cedar Avenue that the Corps of Engineers installed. It's sort of directly beyond the cul-de-sac at C.H. Mason Way. And that berm had a corrugated metal pipe. It was either 24 or 30 inches. I never really saw it in its pristine condition. But that corrugated metal pipe began to deteriorate over time. And as it deteriorated, it brought down the surrounding berm. So if you were to go out there right now, you'd see a wide opening, a relatively wide opening in that berm that allows storm tides and floodwaters to get up into the area beyond the berm. There's wetlands back in there, but also it gets up onto Cedar Avenue. So pretty much anyone who's been around Lewis understands that when we have storm tides, we oftentimes see flooding out on Cedar Avenue at that end, sort of between Nebraska Avenue and Michigan Avenue, the other side of the Children's Beach House is where we oftentimes see that kind of flooding under heavy storm tides. And that's generally because a couple things. We don't see flooding on the beach side of Lewis along the beach. And that's mainly due to the effectiveness of the dunes that are there to protect Bay Avenue and those homes right up against the beach against the kind of flooding that we see from the canal side. And oftentimes when we see flooding from the canal side, it's associated with storms that have northeast winds, nor'easters or hurricanes or those sorts of events that when you look at it on a map, those sorts of winds drive and push the water through the Roosevelt Inlet into the canal. And then it backs up in on the backside of the canal. And because of the deterioration of the berm and the corrugated metal pipe that I talked about before, this is part of the reason why we see flooding back up on the backside of Cedar Avenue. So the purpose of our study is to develop alternatives to cost effectively limit that flooding. We're not saying that we're going to eliminate every occurrence of flooding up in that area, but we do feel like we can develop alternatives that will limit the flooding and assist over the course of time in preventing that from happening as often as it does now. And a key component of it is that there are wetlands behind that berm, between the berm and Cedar Avenue and the backs of the homes on Cedar Avenue. And whatever alternative we were to implement over time in the future has to make sure that we keep those wetlands healthy and thriving. They are healthy and thriving right now. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. But we just can't block up the area so no tidewaters, normal tidewaters can get back into those wetlands, because those normal tide fluctuations keep that marsh healthy. And we want to be able to do that, but we also want to be able to eliminate and try as much as we can to eliminate the storm tides from getting back in there, because they don't keep the wetlands any healthier. They just flood the surrounding area on Cedar Avenue. I also wanted to mention that there is the chat room available, and Janelle Cornwell from the city will be monitoring that, and every 4 or 5 slides as we move through our presentation, we're going to stop and just look at what's in the chat. So if you have any questions or any comments, please put them in the chat room, and we'll get to those every 4 or 5 slides. We won't wait to the end. We want to try and engage those as we go. You know, a key component of what we're doing is sea level rise, and that's a big part of what any proposed alternative as a result of our study will protect against sea level rise, whether you want to call it current day storm tides or sea level rise over time based on projections that we're seeing right now. That's going to be part of our analysis, and whatever alternative we develop will consider sea level rise. The sea level rise projection will depend on the life expectancy of the alternative that we're discussing at that moment. So, you know, some may require projections out 40 years, maybe longer. We haven't developed alternatives yet, all of them. Part of the reason why we're meeting today is to talk about those as well. But some alternatives might only have a 25-year life expectancy. So you wouldn't design it around a 40 or an 80-year sea level rise projection, for instance. A big part of what we did was try to gain input from the public, and we really do appreciate. We had over 80 responses to the Citizen Flood Reporter that the city posted on their website with really good information, photos, and data that will help to influence our study and the alternatives that we develop. We'll talk more about that later. We do want to talk today and get some ideas from everyone that's on the call about potential flood mitigation options. We have an idea or 2 or 3, but we want to hear what other people are thinking as well, especially those that might live right out in that immediate area. And then finally, we're going to talk today about you know, future steps for us to finish the report and how we can engage the stakeholders that are part of this call and that have already commented in the Flood Reporter survey. So just briefly, introductions. City of Lewis is here. Anne Marie Townsend, the city manager. Janelle Cornwell, the planning and development officer. Is there anybody else from the city here now? I know Darren Gordon's here from the Lewis Board of Public Works.
We've got some elected officials here.
Okay,
If you want to introduce them, hold on, let me.
sure. I've
pull
got
up
mine down to just a single screen because otherwise I can't see the presentation very
Yeah,
good.
so we've got Councilperson Williams, Deputy Mayor Osler, and we've got some members of the Planning Commission. We've got Kay Carnahan, Nancy Stacy, and Sumner Crosby.
Excellent. Thank you for being on board. And I think, like I mentioned, Darren Gordon, the general manager of the Board of Public Works, is on the call. From DEMA, we have Karen Montez Barrios, who is, that's Delaware Emergency Management Agency, DEMA. Josh Kelly and Phillips here too. Phillips' last name?
Kane.
Philip Kane. Sorry, Philip. And just so everybody knows, DEMA is funding the study through a grant that the city applied for last year. So they are facilitating the grant, and we're in contact with them on a monthly basis to keep them up to speed on the progress of the study and the tasks associated with it. From Delaware Sea Grant is Danielle Swallow, who's been a big part of obtaining the grant and also just helping us through this whole study and with all sorts of input from her experience and the things that the Sea Grant's involved with now. And then from GMB, our team's here. My name's Charlie O'Donnell. I also have Brent Jett, professional engineer, as part of our team. Kyla Cupp is on the call. She's our GIS specialist, and you'll see why that's so important as we look at some of the modeling efforts that we've completed thus far. Jim Eisenhart is also here. He's part of our team and has a lot of experience with these kinds of projects and is helping us all along the way. I don't know if Steve Marsh is on the call. He's been integral to our efforts as well. So just briefly, I want to quickly run through what we were supposed to do and what we have done. We did get topographical data, both existing from the state and our own data that we collected in the field with our own survey crews. And that's just very important to have that kind of elevation data across the whole area that we're talking about. We did consult with a wetlands professional who is the one who told us that they're healthy and thriving. And he also delineated the state wetlands versus federal wetlands, which we're going to talk about how in that particular area they're basically the same, but we'll show you that. We had to gain some idea of the sea level rise projections. DENREC and the Delaware Geological Survey have done a lot of work. Their last updated sea level rise projections were from 2017, and they had 3 different categories of projections. We'll talk more about them, but they've been that information has been very useful in our discussions thus far. We wanted to obtain local knowledge and flood experience, and we did that via our public survey. Again, thank you for everybody who participated. We wanted to identify at-risk areas. In 2015, the city performed a evaluation of critical infrastructure and evacuation routes, and we were able to identify the at-risk for flooding areas at that time, which I was part of that, and we did a whole study on it, and the results of it were pretty much in line with what everyone has observed over the last quarter century in Lewis, the areas that flood a lot. This area on West Cedar Avenue that we're studying now, obviously Savannah Road on the beach side as you come across the bridge continuously floods. Canary Creek out on New Road was an area that was identified, and parts of Canary Creek on Savannah Road under really severe storm tide conditions, more up towards Drake Knoll in that area, you start to have some problems. But we were able to identify those areas, and this is one that was identified at West Cedar Avenue, and now we're trying to address it and make some improvements out there. Again, consider sea level rise projections with our alternative development. I guess what we're trying to say there is that it's possible to develop alternatives to combat existing conditions, but we want to make sure that whatever alternative is the most feasible at the end of the day considers sea level rise so it has a good long life expectancy and can weather future projections of sea level rise. And then that's what we're talking about, developing mitigation potentials. These are alternatives to try to limit that flooding along the west end of Lewis Beach that comes from the canal side and manifests itself on Cedar Avenue generally between Nebraska and Michigan Avenue. So this is the area that we surveyed. We collected data from the state that's available. They do a flyover, and there's a lot of data that we can get. But we also augmented that because that data is spread out a little bit, so we augmented it with our own field survey, and this area is the area that we surveyed and got data from in the field. When I talk about the study focus area, it's generally up in this area is what we're talking about. And the berm that's deteriorated and the corrugated metal pipe is in this area right here. So we're going to show you our results of our modeling of various storms that you're aware of, actual storms, that show how that flooding got up into this area through that breach in the berm. One thing that we're noticing from our modeling efforts is that floodwaters come up on this end as well. In this finger, this is a Corps of Engineers dredge spoil site, pretty much left over from the days when the Corps used to dredge the canal regularly. They don't do that anymore, but those dredge spoil sites are still there and they're bermed in. So they're not available for flood storage because they have berms that, you know, keep that dredge spoil inside the dredge spoil site. There's another one down here as well. But we are seeing flooding getting up into this area, into the Newark Avenue and Clayton Avenue area of West Cedar. You know, Nebraska's up here. Here's the Children's Beach House, and then this is Michigan. But we are thinking about maybe doing something here. We have to talk about that yet. Obviously, we did survey this area. This is, everybody's familiar with, you know, Belmar and Milton and Houston, pardon me, Lewis, all those cul-de-sacs. And whatever we do at this end will help that some because it won't allow the storm tides to get through the old mosquito ditch and down into those areas that we frequently see flooding up into the cul-de-sacs. But it won't solve that problem. That's a little bit of a deeper problem of we're downstream, trying to get the water out through the downstream. We've had good luck when we maintain this ditch, which I know the city and the board do regularly. And when it gets clean, it seems to limit that flooding onto the cul-de-sacs. You know, there are storm events and tide events that, you know, it's hard to keep the water off the cul-de-sac just because it's such a low elevation to begin with. But we should see some improvement if and when we implement our flood mitigation alternative up at this end down here. But that's to really solve that problem, we need to look a little further downstream as well. So we talked about the wetlands. Maybe I can go back and just show you that they're covered by this pink area, but all this area in here are just pristine, beautiful wetlands that are healthy. And, you know, we definitely want to keep those intact. Wetlands are an important part of flood abatement, flood mitigation. They provide storage and they have vegetation to slow the speed of floodwaters, helping to reduce the height of the floodwater and its destructive potential. I guess I should mention along the way, just take note of these photos. There were a couple already that I passed by, but these came from our citizen survey almost exclusively. I think there's one or two others that we either got from existing sources or maybe GMB picked them up. But, you know, here's those wetlands from Camden Avenue. Looking out into the wetlands. So just re-emphasizing the point of how important those wetlands are to keep them healthy with whatever mitigation alternative we decide to go with. As I noted before, the wetlands are in good health according to our wetlands professional, and they are, you can tell by just looking at them, healthy and thriving. The state and federal wetland lines are extremely similar, basically following along the property lines of the canal side properties. If you've walked down in that West Cedar Avenue end in the backyards, the wetlands pretty much come right up to a lot of the backyards there, and the state and federal wetland lines are generally similar. We saw some federal wetland lines in the paper street areas that weren't state wetlands, but we had those delineated and they're part of our mapping and part of our study now. And the spoil sites are in good condition. Some cells are being actively used. Those are generally down towards the Savannah Road end, right behind the marina, Anglers Road Marina there. I know the city, when it dredges its dock areas, it will deposit some of those spoils in that area. So maybe we'll stop right here and see what's on the chat room, if anything, and try to address what we can, and then we'll move on to our next section of the presentation.
I don't have any questions at the moment, Charlie.
Okay. Well, Brent is going to walk us through some of the tidal information and datums. These are the standards that we use to describe heights of tide levels as they move in and out of Roosevelt Inlet, the canal, and Delaware Bay. So Brent, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can walk us through the next 3 or 4 slides.
Okay. So in order to put all the information that we have together and make sure that it's in the same spatial reality and plays well with one another, we have to get a datum that everybody agrees on and all the data agrees with. So using the NOAA data, using our survey data, using the LIDAR data, and creating a map in order to model different storm events and different surges and different sea level rise scenarios. Basically, NAVD 88, which is the national standard for vertical, is set at 0. As you can see from this little picture here, this basically covers a 2-day stretch. So each day you're going to have 2 high tides. So the mean higher high water is the average over the time frame that they run this of the higher high tide. You may hear us reference mean higher high water, or MHHW, occasionally. Basically, that's what you're going to get once a day for the tide push. I don't like to call it nuisance flooding because it's more than a nuisance sometimes, and it's going to change over time. And this is an average over 17 or 18 years that NOAA ran it. So there's more than nuisances in there. There's more than lows in there. But it's an important number to keep in mind, because on a normal average day, you're going to see that elevation. All right, I think we can go to the next one. So here you see the actual data from NOAA. They ran an epic from 1983 to 2001, did all the averages, and this is what all the data is based on. In the future, we're going to show a couple of slides of tide reaches and high tides and the tide graphs. What they have as projected and the actual are all based on this. I did some digging and ran some numbers for about 2 years of tide data for the past, most recent 24 months, and found that the actual water elevation runs about 7 inches higher than what they were projecting. So if you really want to just look at it as a basic back of the envelope thought process, for the epic that ends in 2001, their mean sea level is minus 0.4. Basically, the sea level has already risen 6 or 7 inches to 2020 since then. Some of that is there's variance in the water levels, just how it bounces around. 1 year you might be above average, 1 year you might be below average, but over that 2-year period, we averaged about 7 inches above what the projection is. And this epic was used to create those projections. It's not a hard and fast rule that we've already seen 7 inches of sea level rise, but it's a good indicator that there's something baked into that 7 inches that it's already occurred.
And Brent, I think that mean sea level is one that everyone's going to want to keep in mind, because when we describe sea level rise projections over the next several decades, it's going to be revolved around that mean sea level. As of 2001, that was negative 0.40 based on the NAVD 88 datum. But when we show you those projections, you're going to see something different over time.
Right. So this is the chart that everybody should be familiar with. What Lewis has been using to inform basically everything that they're kind of working around is the green line. University of Delaware has it shown as the intermediate line. What that means is there's a 50% chance that it's going to meet or exceed that amount of sea level rise by that date. The red is there's a 95% chance that it could. The blue line is, the blue line is there's a 95% chance that it'll meet or exceed that elevation or amount of sea level rise. The red is there's a 5% chance. So the red's on the high end, the blue's on the low end, the green's in the middle. Just for informational purposes, for all the subcommittees for the Planning Commission, what the mayor and council have kind of been utilizing has been the green line for the projection in the future.
And I think it's important just to note, because the chart's in meters, but you know, those of us more familiar with, you know, English units, you know, by 2050, that intermediate projection is a 1.31 foot sea level rise. In the next 60 years, it's 2.43 feet, and over 80, it's 3.25. So this is important as when we talk about, if you recall what we were talking about before, when we develop our alternatives, we need to establish what the sea level rise is for each one of those alternatives, depending on its life expectancy. So this is important information that we want to integrate into our thought process and into our preliminary designs.
Right. So let me stop real quick. I see Sumner had a question, and Danielle answered it, but I'm not sure Danielle's answer got back to Sumner. So they run an epic on a 19-year cycle that's inclusive. This 19-year cycle ends this year, and then NOAA will work on updating it and go through the QA/QC process. So that mean sea level elevation will get revised sometime in the future once 2020 finally ends, and they can run the epic data.
2020 has been epic, that's for sure.
Yeah. So this is depicting and utilizing the infield topo that we got combined with the LiDAR data, the projected sea level rise in 2050 and 2100. You can see a couple little yellow lines in those two guts that we were discussing before, that the standard sea level would kind of come up into them, and they would no longer be a up and down wet dry gut. They would end up being a wet gut and potentially expand a little bit. But in 2100, when an additional nearly 2 feet on top of the 2050, you see the inundation levels. And this is the standard sea level. This isn't high tide, low tide. This is right in the middle.
Yeah, this is based on mean sea level. So this would be a normal, you know, average situation. And I think this is a good drawing, because where we were talking about earlier, how the flooding accesses the backs of these homes in Cedar Avenue. It's right through here. This white area is where the existing Corps of Engineers berm was, and right where that gut is, or that little creek goes through and bisects the berm, is where that pipe used to be and where the berm has deteriorated. So this is how the flooding occurs, right through that point. And it gets all, this is a really good drawing because it kind of mimics what we're seeing right now under, heavy storm tide events. And what I was talking about before was this area right here is also an area where storm tides are getting up into this vicinity, and we're considering this as well as part of this study. Okay. We were real happy to set up the Citizen Flood Reporter survey that was on the city's website. We had over 80 responses. A whole lot of them had photos and good description of flooding that occurred either historically or more recently. We were both unlucky and lucky to have the remnants of Hurricane Zeta come through at the end of October, because it's a microcosm of the kind of flooding that we observed during those kinds of storm events and that kind of storm tide associated with it. And we got a lot of comments about those, which were really good. And also it's fresh on everybody's mind. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, you can just recall back to October 29th, 30th, and 30th and understand what it is we're talking about. But we got really good historical and real-time data. What we noticed from going through all the information was that we had a really good sense of the general scope of the flooding, but we also got data from individuals on just little locations that were hidden, that should be addressed in one way or another. So that was real valuable to get that kind of more particular hidden area data and information on flooding. And we really expect this to influence how we develop our alternatives. All that said, we had two categories of responses. Some were storm tidal, responses that talked about, hey, during Winter Storm Jonas, we saw the water up to such and such level, and we took some pictures, and here they are, that kind of thing. But we also had a lot of responses, related to rainfall events. And whereas this project's not addressing stormwater management or stormwater solutions, we are going to include those in our report so that we don't forget about them, and they're things that we can address as time goes forward. One thing I should say is, even though we're not addressing, a localized rainwater problem on a particular street, we do have to consider stormwater runoff, because if we eliminate storm tides from getting up into the Cedar Avenue area, that's going to happen, as Brent mentioned, every 6 hours as the tide changes. So we want to allow that water to get back out as the low tide comes, as the tide ebbs and it's low tide again. We want the rainwater to go out with that tide. So we do have to consider stormwater and getting it out depending on our alternative that we select, but we're not solving every stormwater related issue in the area. But we are going to include those in our report so we have a record of them. So some of the takeaways, from our public survey, I talked about, some were rain related, some were tide related. You know, as I've been talking about today, you know, here's a picture from Zeta just a couple weeks ago, how bad that area, our focus area of our study was during that storm. But it's, you know, we want to mitigate storm tides. So this information is really helpful, as I talked about just a few minutes ago, in trying to develop those alternatives. And I noted that we will note the rainfall issues, so we have a record of them. And the city's planning on leaving the flood reporter survey open. So, you know, please continue to have people, or if you've already done it and you observe something new, put it up on the flood reporter so that we can collect that information. It's valuable to us and how we move through this project. So we just want to again thank you for the contributions. Some more photos that we got as part of the flood survey and the flood reporter. It doesn't always bother everybody, but you know, this is up near Newport Avenue, and this is on Cedar Avenue as well. So again, we'll stop right here for any chat room questions.
So we have one from Sumner, and it's, given the sea level rise projection, should we continue to give the 0.5 slope waivers on storm pipes, particular in the lowest elevation areas?
Oh,
I'll
I
take
think
a
that-
stab at
well,
that
I
one,
mean, yeah, well,
if you want. So
go
if
ahead.
we-
I mean, I just think we can talk about that, Sumner. I just, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this project, I think, but we can certainly talk about it. Go ahead, Brent.
if you have a tide gate, the slope's not going to matter if the tide gate's functioning properly.
I think Sumner's talking about for development.
Subdivisions.
Yeah, subdivisions where the code says 0.5%. But
Yeah, you can
it's a different issue. Sumner, we can talk about that definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's all we have in the chat at the moment.
Okay. Brent and I are going to sort of tag team the next section, which is where we talk about the research that we did into historical storm and tide events and try to model those. And I think those modeling images will be kind of eye-opening. As I noted before, a lot of where we see flooding, people who live in Lewis and travel around Lewis sort of anecdotally are aware of where we see these problems. So it's not going to be a huge surprise to you, but to see it on a map and see what the various historical storms look like in terms of flooding can be quite eye-opening and also very effective in GMB developing our alternatives as part of this study. So Brent, why don't you take off with it, and I'll just kind of put in where I can.
Okay, so these are 3 of the highest 7 tide elevations that we saw. Given that we never had a gauge in the middle of Cedar Avenue to determine historic elevations in 62 versus 92 versus 94 versus the back-to-back nor'easters versus Jonas, because they all had different precipitation rates. The best that we can use as a baseline and know that this is the bare bones bottom is the tide gate that's located on the pier at the ferry terminal. Very close by. You're going to have within half an inch elevation of the tide located out here on Cedar Avenue in association with these. It's interesting of note that the Ash Wednesday storm is not the highest tide that was ever recorded out there. That was actually in Jonas, which was just over half an inch higher than what the Ash Wednesday storm was. There's a couple others, the back-to-back nor'easters in late January and early February. And then there was another one, I believe, in January. It's interesting of note that 6 of the 7 highest tides recorded out there are January, February, or March. So they're all hitting at winter storms. Nor'easters are pushing in. And the only outlier is Sandy, which isn't a big surprise, but even Zeta, as it rolled across, was 2 feet short of what Jonas was.
I would just add to that, for all the years that I've been the city and board engineer, we always talked about the 62 storm as the, the highest tide ever observed. In fact, people remember the signs that were painted and created and put around various parts of Lewis that showed that elevation. But, it's really interesting to note that Winter Storm Jonas actually topped the 62 storm. So there's a new standard to compare against.
Just about neck and neck. I mean, it was 6.63 versus 6.59.
Yeah, not much different.
What may have exacerbated Jonas a little bit was this doesn't take into account localized flooding based on precipitation on top of the tide. This is just a straight, call it a level that all the water around there got to elevation 6.63. Then you throw the 6 inches of snow and ice and rain on top of it for Jonas, and then that kind of gets exacerbated a little bit. I'm pretty sure there was a lot of precipitation associated with the Ash Wednesday storm as well. So I'm sure that there were localized areas. Given that information, that the Ash Wednesday storm was at 6.59, but the FEMA flood elevations out there are at 7 and 8, tells you that localized things can definitely be deeper than what the tide just shows. These are good ideas of potential sea level rise in the future without a 1% storm event or a big Sandy event.
And Brent, everyone will be able to see that pretty clearly when we get to the model that we did for Zeta, which is in a few slides, where it really doesn't show the tide elevation getting up into Cedar Avenue. But even the photos that we showed earlier, or anybody who drove out that way that day knows that, there was a foot at least of water in Cedar Avenue along a certain stretch of our study focus area. And I think this is an interesting one. This is the back-to-back nor'easter of January 28th and February 5th of 98, which a lot of people do remember that. I remember that. And these tide images are available through NOAA if you get to the right web location. And they show the blue predicted tides, and then they show the actual verified tides. And you can see on the 28th how the higher tides are much higher than the predicted tides. And that's what we observed when we modeled it. We put it out into this plan view here. And the same thing happened on the February 5th.
And you'll see on these two that the peaks, when the peak comes down, the low tide is even higher than the predicted high tide, or in the same general vicinity.
Yeah.
That's when you get into water standing for longer than 24 or 48 hours. And that's when problems really start to get exacerbated.
Yeah, good point. So you're going to see a few images like this, and just take note of the scale down in the bottom right-hand corner. The green is, less deep. As you move into the blue, it's more deep, and obviously the red and orange are the deepest. So as we move into our area of concern on these 98 storms, it was deeper in the wetlands area and in the guts, in the little creeks. And as you moved out, it got a little less deep, but still certainly, of concern as you move on to Cedar Avenue and beyond.
So real quick, I see Andrew's question about the lunar cycle. So the lunar cycle shows up in the projections. So occasionally the projection's a little bit higher. I haven't dug deep enough to see if any of these storms occurred on a full moon or not. It appears that on this one that the full moon may have been the 29th of January. So it happened to coincide with that.
Yeah, I think Zeta, when we get to Zeta, you can see that a little bit clearer, but definitely if it's on that full moon, new moon cycle, it exacerbates it.
Yeah, you're going to get a little bit of a push, but you have to also take into consideration the higher it gets, the more it goes onto land. So the high tide really, the difference between mean sea level and mean high water isn't necessarily the same. You're actually constricting it or compacting it a little bit because it's going further on land.
So everybody remembers Sandy, and it's not quite as high as the 62 storm or Jonas, but still up there over 6 feet. These are some photos we got from the flood reporter survey of what was going on. This is down Delmar Avenue, which is further down by the cul-de-sacs, but just wanted to give a sense of how drastic it was during Sandy. And we were sort of lucky with Sandy, so keep that in mind.
Definitely.
Then this is Jonas. This is the highest one, that highest observed water level that we've ever observed in Lewis, January 2016. And I remember driving around and not being able to drive around many places, including trying to get through Anglers Road or anywhere around there. You want to take this one, Brent?
So this is showing, again, just straight tide elevation, the inundation heat map. As you go from green to blue to yellow to red, it gets deeper locally where it is. With the Jonas storm, you're looking at the 2100 event plus high tide plus a foot surge. So this could be a full moon tide in 2100 on a normal day without rain.
Based on sea level rise projections.
Correct.
Yeah. And another thing to take note here is the bluer areas. You can see it clearly over here how this is an entry point for flooding into our, just adjacent to the main study area, but something that we're thinking about. So this is behind the homes on Newark Avenue.
So Zeta, I don't know how much warning we had for Zeta. I don't know how much concern we had for Zeta. Between Thursday and Friday, there was 2¼ inches of rain in Lewis. So it really wasn't even, off the charts. It was a 6-month rain event, according to the current scheduling or however you want to call it. But it wasn't an anomaly. Over those 2 days, over 24 hours, to get 2¼ inches of rain wasn't an inundation thing, but the wind turned just right, and you can see the depths that we got with the flooding. So if you look at the middle projection for 2050, put a high tide on top of it, put a full moon on top of that, and 2¼ inches of rain, this is what you definitely could see on a rainy day around a full moon in 2050. And this isn't, what it really did for us was I can show you the models, I can show you the heat maps, I can run scenarios. It gave us a dress rehearsal for different areas and how it's going to feel and how everything's going to operate if we don't do anything in the next 30 years to address it.
So I think it's important to look at this image and note that it really doesn't show the tide only getting up into Cedar Avenue. But when you throw the 2.5 inches over a 24-hour period of rain, it did flood Cedar Avenue. As you know, these are some photos that we took.
So we have to keep that in mind because we understand that that's going to exacerbate the flood and the tide push.
Yeah.
So when you have the two together, you end up with a blammo. It's not just here and there.
So Janelle, we wanted to see if anything was in the chat room at this point.
So we had a question from Sumner, just looking at the location of the tide gauge. Should we have some direct investment inside of the inlet for tide gauge because it's down at the ferry? And then you did address Andrew's question about the lunar cycle. And then Sumner had saying that having looked at a bunch of these storms, highest tides events are correlated with long periods of easterly, principally northeasterly winds, maybe 15 to 20 knots, nearby nor'easters, or even ones that are out in the ocean. It's just a comment. And then he appreciates Brent's forward thinking of our dress rehearsal for the future with the sea level rise.
So I will say I like the idea of potentially getting, a tide gauge somewhere in here. If it could be paid for and maintained and managed, maybe we take an alternate step with a warning system of if we have winds in this direction and it hits a certain elevation out at the pier, then we understand that it's going to be higher through the inlet and up the canal. I think Chris Field had run something similar in a warning system previously. I'm not sure how operational it is now, and I'm not sure how it functioned. I've tried to get some information on it, but the locals down there kind of keep to themselves and don't share it very well. But I'll see if I can find some information because they understand kind of the lay of the land, that if the wind's coming from here and we've got this, then we're going to get a lot of water.
Right. And Danielle provided some information that it's always best to have a long record of observations, which is why there's definitely value in the NOAA tide gauge. And we wouldn't have that with a new tide gauge. However, information is always helpful.
Yeah, I think Brent made a good point that if we were to go in that direction, which I think is feasible, you might even be able to find grant funding for it. It has to be maintained because they're not simple devices. There's some work to keeping them maintained and collecting the data. But
yeah, so full disclosure, I used to work for the city of Cambridge for nearly 8 years, and we had the NOAA east side of the Chesapeake tide gauge there that's been there for, I guess, probably 100 years. And they were out there all the time with that thing. And that's the one that informs all the counties on the east side of the Chesapeake Bay. They utilize that one. So I know they're very invested in this one, given the ferry, given the commerce and everything that's connected to it. And it's the first one around the hook coming up the bay. I'm not sure another one is feasible for them. Potentially it is. Potentially University of Delaware sees value in something I don't know. It's a conversation that can definitely be had, though.
Yeah, and I think it's something that our mitigation team can drive a little bit. So, we're just starting to develop our alternative ideas, and we're kind of winding down on our presentation, but we did want to show you one of the ideas that we have that's actually been utilized up in Kitts Hummock along the Delaware Bay. And a similar system, not more recently in Dewey Beach, where they have tide gate valves as well. What we're showing here are self-regulating tide gate valves. So this would be a project where the deteriorated berm would be repaired and probably strengthened somehow. Brent and I were just talking about it today about strengthening the berm. In these photos, they call it the levee. We're calling it the berm. The berm would need to be addressed because we might want to address it in terms of its height for sea level rise. But also we would want to strengthen it by possibly putting something internal to it. I know down in Dewey Beach, they put what are known as gabions. They look like crepes, but they're full of large riprap rock, and they put those inside the berm area, and it allows, down there they were calling them dunes, but it just helps to keep that whole berm levee area stabilized against the kind of forces that these waters have when they come in. So we would look to probably do that and then install some sort of tide gate, self-regulating tide gate along these lines. This is straight from a manufacturer's catalog. We haven't gotten into any final development of alternatives, but this is one that's been poking around in our heads for a long time now, where it allows normal tides to come in and out, in and out, in and out, and that helps to keep the wetlands thriving and healthy. But as this tide gate gets up and a storm tide comes in, when it gets to a certain level, the self-regulation part of it means that it'll just shut it fully closed so that storm tide is shut off from the wetlands and the Cedar Avenue area. And then as the tide recedes, it opens back up again. And this is where I was talking about. It allows whatever tide has built up in the wetlands and Cedar Avenue area to get out, but also any runoff that makes its way out this way would be able to get out at that point as well.
So what you see in number 4 over here is how the tide is a little bit higher than the backwater. So the tide could rise. So look at a Sandy event. The tide's going to be high in the canal. The levee will keep the tide from coming into the West Cedar area. We're going to have 6 inches of rain. There's going to be enough water from that to run off, but it won't be as deep as the canal side. So it'll impound for a little bit and hold back. And the hope is that there's enough storage in the wetlands area and the guts in there that it'll get off the roadway, get off the properties, get into the wetlands, keep the wetlands fed, but not keep them inundated with 6 feet of water. It'll just be the runoff from the storm. And then when the tides recede in 36, 48 hours, the gate will open back up and let the backwater out.
Yeah, and we can set this elevation, that would be part of our design effort to set those elevations. So I guess we wanted to open it up to any ideas everyone has about, flood mitigation ideas and, either adding on to this idea or other ideas that people have been thinking about that might mitigate flooding out in the West Cedar Avenue end of the road. Are you seeing anything, Janelle?
Not at the moment. I do just have a general question. I know we're looking at like some bigger picture items, but are there some small projects that like a homeowner could do that would be something that just could help just a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. You know, in terms of storm tides or in terms of just runoff, I know, you know, some of the things that we've been talking about, part of our subcommittees are just, you know, increasing the permeability of your home site. A lot of people have driveways. It would be nice if they were permeable pavers that allowed runoff to infiltrate into the underlying soils. That would be a big help rather than just having that impervious driveway area. That's a big one. There are other kind of smaller potatoes ways of just capturing runoff or rainwater runoff and not allowing it to flood, you know, you're in a localized way.
Okay, thanks. So now we have a couple of questions. If you do have the tide gauge installed to the east of the obvious, would you have the tide gauge installed to the east of that obvious dredge spoil area south of Michigan?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that in enough detail, but I believe it's the same arrangement where there's like a creek or gut that runs through there between the two dredge spoil sites, allowing the floodwaters to migrate up towards Newark and Clayton Avenue in Odessa. So yeah, we need to look at that yet, but that, you know, if we decided it was the right thing to do, maybe we would do one at the CH Mason Way berm that's deteriorated and maybe one in between the two dredge spoil sites in that other area. We need to look at that though.
Okay, and then if the floodgate closes off flow at its juncture, where does the water go?
So what they call the levee is going to be parallel with the canal. So the canal water can build up side impounds in the wetlands area between the levee and the back of the properties. Where you're not, well, there's the potential to not alleviate 100% of flooding in Cedar Street, but there is a potential to not have 5 feet of flooding in Cedar Street.
Yeah, I never liked this particular image because I
It
felt
needs
like
to show a greater difference in
yeah,
elevation.
I didn't feel like it showed. I think we can set our tide gauge such that this, at least in terms of the storm tide, would be lower on the Cedar Avenue side. Like Brent's been mentioning, though, what is happening on this side is that stormwater is collecting, so it will build up, and there might be some flooding due to the stormwater, but we're hoping to eliminate the storm tide flooding, which we feel is a major component of the flooding that's observed out there during these nor'easter storms as the wind drives the tide into the inlet, in through the inlet. And, you know, as Brent just mentioned, the height of this levee, the height of this berm is important because we're going to want to size it or put that elevation to a point where it does keep the water on the canal side back and not over top it. And of course, that's a little bit of a cost feasibility analysis, but also sea level rise projection part of it as well.
Okay. Next question is, what role might a sea level rise induced higher water table have in complicating this picture, particularly as it relates to stormwater storage in your thinking?
It's hard to tell how saturated ground is going to affect. You know, like we said, that 6 of the 7 highest tides have been recorded in January, February, or March. That's historically when groundwater is the highest. I'm not sure anybody has a good enough grasp on the overall effect of it. We have to be cognizant of it, but I'm not sure that we can really wrangle it right now. Just address with what we can actually see and do as much as we can with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about, at least in this alternative, is just keeping the surface water from getting to Cedar Avenue. And like we've been talking about, the rainwater comes down during a rain event. If there's a surge, a storm tide event and a rain event, sort of like what we saw with Zeta, and the groundwater is rising in the next 20, 30, 10, 20, 30 years, obviously that rainwater is not going to be able to infiltrate to the same effectiveness as it does right now. So that, that's going to make it worse. And I think you can generally say that rising groundwater would make all these situations a little worse.
Okay, and then the next question is, can you remind us where these are currently being utilized in other areas? So the tidal gate.
Mm-hmm.
You said
So I know
Kitsummik?
Kitsummik has one that's very similar to this arrangement. And I know they have tide gates down in Dewey Beach, but I haven't looked at them to know whether they're similar to this. But we do plan on looking at those. I think Jim Eisenhardt's group might have had something to do with that. So
yeah, there's a couple different technologies, and the one that was just installed in Dewey, they call it Tide Flex valves, smaller than you're going to be dealing with here. There's also some up in Newcastle County with the levees that have been used for a while. So there is precedent throughout the state for it.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm not sure if they utilized any in Prime Hook or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I didn't see the final on that.
Yeah, I haven't seen the final drawing. I know that they did a lot of remediation in the wetland area and raising things up. My feeling is that they're out there somewhere as an integral part for an additional cell, but yeah. I can't confirm that.
These are, we were just trying to think of Delaware examples, but these are being utilized along the East Coast and the Southeast, out West.
And apparently there's a lot of examples in Louisiana, we were just informed.
Yeah.
Jim mentioned Tide Flex valves, which we do utilize those in Lewis. And in fact, on Nebraska Avenue, there's a storm drain and catch basin system that has a pipe outfall to the canal just west of our study focus area, and it has a Tide Flex valve at the end of the outfall that won't allow tides to back up into that catch basin on Nebraska Avenue. And we have those different places around town to try to eliminate that kind of tide getting back up into pipes and flooding through storm drain systems. The problem is with those is, if you have a rain and they're shut, they do open up and then the tide gets in a little bit. So it's always a little bit of a balancing act with all these types of things. With the rain.
There's several being utilized in Crisfield as part of their remediation from Sandy. We had quite a few in Cambridge. There's a couple in St. Michael's and Oxford.
Yep.
Janelle, anything else?
I don't have any other questions in the chat.
Okay, well, keep feeding us the questions. I just want to talk about, our final steps. It took us a while to get to this point, several months to collect all the data and develop the models and do all the survey work and put together the public survey and get it out and get the responses back. So now we're going to move from this day forward into finalizing our report. We're going to utilize the input from today's meeting. We'll gather the chat and it will influence our thought process as we move forward. But we're going to start finalizing the report by developing flood mitigation alternatives like we've been talking about, their cost estimates, and then hopefully, finally, when we get through that process, have some recommendations for moving forward. We want to continue to analyze data and the conditions, both from the flood reporter responses and just, you know, if another storm comes around, looking at that data, like we looked at Zeta from last month. Whatever solutions we're looking at, whatever alternatives, we need to consider what the sea level rise projection is the most feasible for that alternative. We don't want to over design it. And again, that has to do with life expectancy. And as I noted above, we'll have budgets and projects listed in the report, and then we'll put together the whole report with a background, all the data collected, all the analysis of the data, a summary of the public input, developing the alternatives, cost estimates, and final recommendations. And of course, this all has to meet the FEMA grant requirements, so we'll be finalizing the report to do just that. And then if all goes well and we come up with a recommendation or a couple or three recommendations that are feasible, we would begin then to look for grant sources for implementing those, actually constructing those in the field. I know FEMA has what they call their brick funding cycle. So that might be a potential grant source. We've talked to Karen about that from DEMA, and possibly, you know, next year's cycle, which those applications would be due at the end of 2021, roughly. We would likely go after that grant source for an actual installation project. And I know Janelle and Anne-Marie, you guys can answer this, but once we finalize the report, we'll make it accessible to the public via the city's website. And I noted
Absolutely.
and I noted that we'll keep the flood reporter open for a while, so we can still collect data from that as we move to the end of the project. If anybody has any questions, you know, you can contact Brent, myself, or Kyla, and we'll try to run it down for you best we can.
Do have a couple more questions that came in.
Okay.
Are there options for doing some living shoreline and or oyster reefs in some select areas to enhance the project?
So I would say if we do a berm, there may be some raised areas around that kind of blend back in. We're definitely going to plant them and have a living shoreline area there. However, in this whole focus area, we've got really good, healthy wetlands that we don't want to disturb too much, and that the established wetlands are probably in better condition and better usefulness than anything we could ever man-made create or recreate or plant or hope to do. As far as the oysters go, I'm not opposed to it. I don't know if Cannery Creek lends itself to that as far as travel lanes and areas. It may. We can investigate it. We can talk to university, see if they have any potential thoughts.
Yeah, we can talk about it with university and Center for the Inland Bays, because I know they get involved with it a lot on the Inland Bay side. But this is a little bit of a different animal since it's just a canal. It's not a bay, for instance.
The only thing,
Another question. Go
if
ahead.
I could, the great answer, Brent. The only thing I could add there is, given the value of that wetland system that we're talking about, if we do see that the water's edge of that tidal wetland system is eroding due to wake energy, et cetera, from the canal, other reasons, there may be good reason to do tow protection on that wetland so we don't lose any more of that wetland for the project. So the oysters or living shoreline type mechanisms, the nature-based solutions protect that wetland. It could be something to look at, but as you said, they're so nice, we'd want to make sure that there's a reason for doing that, as in it's migrating internally due to erosion or some other factor to make sure that
Yeah.
solution is still viable for us in 50 years. So.
Okay, next question is, there are other areas around town also experiencing flooding. Will there be comparable efforts made to study those areas and seek fundings for solutions?
Well,
Anne Marie, you want to take that one?
I was,
Hold on, I'm sorry, I was muted and I
You're fine.
got pulled away. What was the question? I heard the beginning, but not the very end.
Will there be comparable efforts made to study those areas and seek funding for solutions? Because there are other areas around town also experiencing flooding.
At this point, there aren't any plans to. You know, again, this was something that there was a grant opportunity available. We knew that this was an area that you know, has had significant issues with flooding. So it's not to say we won't, but at this point, we don't have plans to.
I'll also, having worked on the public side for a while, most of the time funding agencies that provide grants like you to see eat one piece of fruit at a time. So if we can get through this and accomplish installation of a solution, then that opens up additional opportunities. They most likely aren't going to expand into other areas until we're done with this one.
And we did just do a flood study of another area that I think gave us some good information, and we've been working with DelDOT on the issue of the bridge over Canary Creek. So I think there have been some efforts. It's just been a different focus than this more comprehensive look that we're doing here.
And then the last one was, how do we make use of what you're learning, analyzing here to prevent future additional areas from having to deal with this kind of problem? Are there things that we should be looking to change in the way we evaluate approved developments, for example? And again, they reference Canary Creek, which is a different area, because right now we're just focusing on the West Cedar Street area.
I mean, Janelle, you can probably answer this better than me, but I think the Planning Commission's efforts with regard to their sea level rise subcommittee, floodplain subcommittee, and wetlands buffer subcommittee are doing just that, trying to establish, you know, a more modern approach to development based on these kinds of problems.
Yeah, I think in this case, and for this grant, we're just trying to solve one problem. But yeah, all the work the subcommittees are working on are looking at the more holistic approach of flooding that we've got going on, that we know is going to hopefully, of how do we hopefully reduce some of those impacts from what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's all we've got.
Okay. Well, that's all we have as well. I want to thank everybody for taking the time and for all the questions. And as I mentioned, we're going to be moving into the report and the alternative development with our team and finalizing our report. We expect that to take a couple months. And then, you know, we'll have it up on the website, but please continue to, you know, provide input into the flood reporter as long as it's open up on the city's website.
Thank you, everybody, and everybody enjoy your rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.